In my work, I'm interested in thinking about how the socialist city is not necessarily something which has ceased to exist, but something which is very much still with us today. So I'm interested in thinking about through my own research, which is partly ethnographic. I'm an anthropologist, so I carry out field work on the city today. But I also I'm also partly a historian, a sort of amateur historian and a professional anthropologist. So I also look at archives and look into the past of the socialist city itself. But I'm mostly interested in finding the remnants of the socialist city in today's cities, in the cities of today's Eastern Europe, but also perhaps to some extent in global cities, in cities all over the world. In thinking about how the socialist city as an aesthetic, as an urban morphology, as a way of living your everyday social life in the city exists not only in Eastern Europe, but also potentially can be said to exist in London, in Berlin, in Washington DC, wherever. I'm interested in thinking about the socialist city through the lens of a couple of ideas which question some of the ways in which we talk about the socialist city as being something that no longer exists. The idea of the post-socialist city and the idea of post-socialism in general implies that we've moved beyond socialism and that socialism is something which belongs only to the past. Whereas I'm interested in developing other ideas which are more useful for thinking about how the socialist city continues to be with us today. And there are many different ways of going about thinking about what these sort of socialist afterlives, what these still socialisms consist of. They might not necessarily all be positive, and they're certainly not all negative. However, the important thing is to grasp the extent to which they are still there, and to which they do continue to impact on our lives, on our social lives, on our economic lives, on the way that people do business with each other, and in the way that people interact with their built environments. A lot of scholars of Eastern European architecture and of Eastern European or post-socialist cities have tended to talk about socialist cities as if they had, as if they were failures, as if they were complete and utter miserable, abject failures. The received idea, and there's a sort of fascination with this idea in a lot of the literature, but also in popular culture to do with socialist architecture and with socialist cities, is that socialism fell apart, and together with the socialist regimes, also the architecture and the urban fabrics of these regimes crumbled and fell apart, and they left behind a sort of bleak wasteland. A grey, bleak, empty wasteland where all you have are crumbling tower blocks and infrastructure which no longer works, and poor, unhappy people going about their daily drudgery. So there is this assumption in a lot of the literature, also in these coffee table books that you have published about the socialist city. If you go to a bookshop in New York or in London, or also into the Garage bookshop in Moscow, you will find a sort of series of kind of very beautifully produced, expensive coffee table books devoted to these sort of beautiful ruins, this sort of kind of eroticized fascination with these ruins of socialism, which present an image of socialism as something which architecturally is frozen in time or has fallen apart completely and utterly, as if it were some sort of lost empire. Within the scholarship in particular, there's a sort of strange tension between several different narratives on how it was that the socialist city failed and why it failed. There are some scholars who emphasize that the socialist city failed because in the view of some of these scholars, so the socialist city was and socialist architecture was too focused on economics. That in a way the socialist city was too Marxist. It was too obsessed with industry. It was obsessed with production. It was obsessed with factories. And the way in which these socialist cities, these monotowns, these sort of industrial monotowns, but also more generally socialist cities were built, left no room for cultural life, left no room for the pleasures of urban existence, left no room for unexpected serendipity and spontaneity. And in effect, people in socialist cities were reduced to being these kind of industrial kind of robots who are dehumanized in a sense by their presence in these, by their life in these cities. So, for example, if you read Stephen Kotkin's book on Magnitogorsk, he talks about, which was published in the 1990s, he talks about how the socialist city became an adjunct to industry. And then if you watch a film like Balabanov's Cargo 200, you also see this image of daily life as being this completely obscene, sort of living itself out obscenely and sort of in its kind of dehumanized way in the shadow of this kind of terrifying, foreboding, bleak factory. So there is one narrative which says that the socialist city failed because it was extremely economic. It was too focused on production, and in a way too Marxist, too focused on the economic base as opposed to on the cultural or ideological or aesthetic superstructure. And there's another set of narratives which emphasize that the socialist city failed because conversely it was too aesthetic. There's a famous book by Boris Groys, who's a sort of an art scholar and I suppose in a way a cultural historian of the socialist period, but also has written other books. So in this book, Boris Groys says that in fact socialism was not an economic project; it was a total work of art. Everything about socialism was purely aesthetic. And this narrative of Groys's is replicated in quite a lot of cultural history, in quite a lot of other scholarship on the socialist cities by authors like Katerina Clark, by writers like Vladislav Todorov, and then by a number of other anthropologists and historians who've in recent years borrowed on these narratives of Groys and others, and have produced these visions of the socialist city as being a purely aesthetic project, which is focused only on this sort of on this kind of simulacra of this kind of beautiful life, but which totally neglects the economic sphere, which totally neglects the actual structure of society, and which is supposed to underlay the cultural and ideological sphere. So, in a sense, this narrative suggests that in fact the problem with the socialist city was not that it was too economic, it was that it was too aesthetic, and that in a way the problem with the socialist city is that it wasn't Marxist enough. So you have this sort of parallel narrative, and these two narratives are quite different, quite difficult to reconcile with each other. But they are both narratives of the failure of the socialist city. In a year, at a time in which the infrastructure of the socialist city is becoming increasingly privatized, is becoming increasingly dismantled, whether by private developers or by urban authorities or by national governments or by whoever, when socialist era housing is being demolished, either by developers or for the behest of developers, and this is something that's happening a lot in Moscow. And when, as you have in all sorts of socialist cities, from Warsaw to Sofia to Moscow too, where the empty space, the sort of green empty spaces, with which socialist planners purposely filled cities in order to provide people with a sort of infrastructure for leisure, these green spaces in between buildings are being filled up with kind of speculatively built office towers or with residential blocks. So at a time when the sort of degradation of what it was that made the socialist city an interesting, in many ways a problematic place, but in a different kind of urban space from the urban spaces of the capitalist world, at a time when this infrastructure and this urban aesthetic is being dismantled, it's increasingly important to think about how we can actually learn from the achievements of the socialist city rather than purely concentrating on its failures, or on its perceived or its actual failures. So one example of an actually existing socialist space, which I think functions in a successful but also in a rather subversive way in the context of the city in which it's in now, is the Palace of Culture of Science in Warsaw, which is a 230-meter high Stalinist skyscraper, which was gifted to the city of Warsaw by Stalin in 1955, and which in a way was built as a very kind of oppressive structure, which dominates over the cityscape of a city that was destroyed during the war. And when Warsaw was being rebuilt, this sort of vast Stalinist kind of phallic skyscraper was plonked right into the middle of it. And the Palace of Culture was perceived by many, for a long time, by many inhabitants of Warsaw, as a very oppressive thing, as a building which was conceived of as a symbol, as a manifestation of Soviet or even perhaps of Russian domination over Warsaw. However, at the same time, the Palace of Culture was filled with a huge diversity of different kinds of social and cultural facilities. It was a palace of culture and science in the sense that it contained the headquarters of the Polish Academy of Sciences. It contained several theatres, more serious kind of avant-garde theatres, but also a puppet theatre. It contained a huge congress hall for 3,000 people, which was the meeting place for the congresses of the Communist Party, but was also the place where you would go to see Miles Davis playing at the Jazz Jamboree, or to see the Rolling Stones playing as they did in Warsaw in 1967. So it was this strange place which was simultaneously associated always with sort of oppressive Soviet domination and communist power, which many people in Warsaw, which not everyone was negatively disposed to, but many people were. But at the same time, it was also this place of contact with culture, with both a Polish culture, with theatre, but also with the only place where you could go to see a sort of famous American jazz musician play, and where you could pick up a book, where you could pick up an English language or a French language philosophy book. You would go to the Polish Academy of Sciences bookshop to pick that up. It also contained the Palace of Youth, which was this huge extracurricular centre with a swimming pool and gymnasiums, which hundreds of thousands of and art classes and theatre facilities, which hundreds of thousands of Warsaw youths have passed through. So it was a place where there was a huge diversity of public facilities, and now that communism has ended, most of those facilities are still there. And the Palace of Culture still functions as this sort of lively, throbbing beehive of social life in a city which otherwise is being increasingly ruthlessly privatized, in a city where a lot of urban land and a lot of urban infrastructure is being given back to private landowners, to property speculators in most cases, who are demolishing much of this social infrastructure. In a way, the Palace of Culture is a sort of enclave of still socialist life in a city which otherwise is being totally and utterly subjected to the sort of rather to the degradations, to the privations which go along with which have accompanied the reprivatization of urban life after 1989. In a sense, the Palace of Culture can be considered in today's Warsaw as a sort of island or as an enclave of still socialist culture, of kind of communist or socialist publicness in a city which is otherwise being quite sort of ruthlessly subjected to the privatizing and privationary pressures of a kind of late capitalist urban environment.